There's a spot on Mount Everest that almost every climber who has gone up the north side knows by heart, even though it never had a name on any map. No sign marks it. No. For nearly 30 years, it was one of the most trusted checkpoints on the whole mountain. The kind of place climbers used to judge how much air was left in their tank and how much mountain still stood between them and the top. What made this checkpoint different from every other landmark on Earth is what it actually was. Not a boulder shaped like in a storm decades ago and whose body settled into a shallow dent in the limestone and simply stayed there, because at that height, almost nothing that dies ever really leaves. And here's the part that turns this from an old mountaineering story into something you need to hear right now. In the summer of 2026, while you are watching this, a government has finally sent a team up that same ridge to bring him home. 30 years before you keep watching, if stories like this are your kind of thing, tap subscribe now, because we are about to walk through one of the strangest, saddest, and most quietly controversial chapters in the entire history of climbing, and there's a twist in the middle of it that most people who think they know this story have never heard. Here is where we are headed. First, the storm in May 1996 that put this man on that ridge in the first place, and the strange geography of the place on Everest doctors call the death zone, a stretch of mountain where the human body is dying no matter how fit or careful the person inside it happens to be. Then the decade that followed, when hundreds of climbers walked past a curled-up body in green boots and turned it, almost without meaning to, into a landmark. Then 2006, and a second death in the very same alcove, one that made international headlines, and pulled, finally, the reversal. What changed in 2014, what a DNA test just revealed about who this man actually was, and what is happening on that mountain this year as his country tries to finally bring him down. Start with the mountain itself, because nothing in this story makes sense without understanding the death zone. It is not a dramatic nickname invented for a documentary. It is a precise medical description. Below that altitude, there is still enough oxygen in the air to think clearly, to weigh a decision, to decide that turning back is smarter than pushing on. Above it, your body starts dying, slowly, with every single breath you take, no matter how much you trained for it or how many times you have summited before. Everest, without bottled oxygen, that number can fall so low that doctors would consider to around a third of what a healthy person carries at sea level, a reading so low that it found with it in an intensive care unit would be rushed into treatment immediately. Up there, it is simply what breathing looks like. The body fights back the only way it knows how. The heart races, sometimes past 140 beats a minute, just to push what little oxygen there is through the system fast enough to keep organs alive. Breathing rate can climb to 4 times its normal resting pace. Digestion effectively shuts off, because the body decides food is a luxury it can no longer afford to process, which is one reason climbers can lose 1 to 2% of their body weight a day at extreme altitude, their own muscle being a kind of oxygen-starved confusion that can look, from the outside, like a person sliding into a waking dream. Judgment blurs. Memory drops out in patches. Climbers have described losing entire stretches of their own summit day, and some doctors consider the strangest cases a form of altitude-triggered delirium, where exhausted, freezing climbers report seeing companions who are not there, or simply lose the ability to process something as basic as whether the still figure ahead of them on the trail needs help. That single detail, more than any other fact in this story, is the key to almost everything that follows. Together. Partway up, 3 sensed the weather turning and made the harder, wiser choice to turn back. The remaining 3 kept climbing. Expedition leader Subedar Sewang Smanla, Lance Naik Dorje Morup, and Head Constable Sewang Paljor. All 3 were trained, capable climbers who believed that day that they had what it took to finish the job. At around 3:45 in the afternoon, they radioed down that they had reached something closer to sacred than something to be conquered. And then, according to several accounts, the leader chose to stay a little longer to complete part of a religious ritual, sending the other 2 ahead to begin the descent without him. That single decision, small as it must have felt in the moment, appears to have cost all 3 men their lives, as a climber can make, because the mountain does not wait politely for anyone to finish. Further radio contact came after that final message from the top. Teams lower on the mountain reported watching 2 headlamps moving slowly somewhere above a technical section of the route, known as the second step, at roughly 8,700 meters. Neither light ever reached the high camp. By morning, 3 men who had radioed down in triumph the night before about how blame and memory behave differently above 8,000 meters than they do anywhere else on the planet. Then, Japanese expedition from Fukuoka was climbing the same route that same day, pushing upward as the storm worsened. On their way to the summit, they passed figures on the fixed ropes, wearing goggles and oxygen masks that hid their faces completely, and assumed they were looking at members of a separate Taiwanese team also on the mountain. Nobody in the Japanese party yet knew an Indian team was missing. On the way back down, one of their climbers reportedly exchanged a few words with a man standing near the route above a feature called the first step, and their team's own oxygen supply was already critically low by that point, barely enough to get themselves down alive. It was only once they reached a lower camp that they learned 3 Indian climbers were unaccounted for on the slopes above them. Altitude would very likely have added new names to the death toll rather than saving the ones already lost. One of those 3 bodies came to rest in a shallow limestone alcove at roughly 8,500 meters on the northeast ridge, just below a landmark called the First Step. And as expedition after expedition passed the same fixed route on the north side in the years that followed, climbers began to recognize the same shape curled in the same shallow cave, wearing a pair of bright lime green mountaineering boots. For years, nobody publicly confirmed exactly whose body it was. Climbers largely did not ask. They simply absorbed the sight into their private map of the mountain, the same way you might remember a bend in a long trail or a boulder shaped like an animal. Around here is where the fixed ropes turn. Around here is where the wind starts to bite harder. And in that same stretch, there is a man curled against the rock who never got any further. Nobody remembers exactly when the nickname started or who said it first. It was never given with any ceremony. It simply became the term climbers used, the way you might casually name a landmark on a familiar hike. Over the years, the phrase green boots stopped sounding like a description of a corpse and started sounding, unsettlingly, like the name of a place. Guides used the alcove as a checkpoint, telling clients how much farther they had left to climb based on how close they were to it. A man with a name, a rank, a family, and a life before that storm had effectively become a piece of the mountain's geography. This is where the story gets harder to sit with, because it leads directly into one of the most argued over deaths in modern Everest history. In May 2006, 10 years after the storm that likely created that landmark, a 34-year-old English mountaineer named David Sharp was descending from the summit when his body began to fail. Sharp had climbed with minimal support, without a large guided team, and, according to several accounts, without much supplemental oxygen, a choice he had reportedly defended before the climb by saying he was willing to give up fingers or toes to reach the top. By the time he reached the stretch of ridge near that same limestone alcove, he was in serious, visible trouble. A climbing guide named Mark Inglis, leading his own group past that stretch of the route, radioed down for advice on how to help Sharp, who was found in a hypothermic state inside what climbers now recognized as Green Boots Cave. The response he received offered no realistic path forward. At that altitude, with the resources any single team had on hand, there was no safe way to carry a critically hypothermic adult back down technical, icy terrain. Inglis continued his own descent. Sharp died of hypothermia, and possibly brain swelling from lack of oxygen, some hours later. What makes the story almost impossible to sit comfortably with is what happened around him while he was dying. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 30 and 40 other climbers are believed to have passed that same spot over the course of that day. Some later said they assumed the still figure in the cave was simply Green Boots, the familiar landmark they had heard about or seen before, rather than a living person in the last hours of his life. It is a chilling detail, and also a genuine window into what extreme altitude does to human perception. At 8,500 meters, with your own body screaming for oxygen, and your own judgment already compromised, telling a dying stranger, apart from a corpse that has been part of the landscape for a decade, may not have been the moral failure it looks like from sea level. It may simply have been what a starved brain does under that kind of stress, when a climber's own survival is hanging by the same thin thread as the person in front of them. That explanation did not stop the story from causing outrage once it reached the rest of the world. It did, and fiercely. Climbers, journalists, and mountaineering veterans argued for years about the unwritten rules of Everest, about when survival justifies walking past someone in trouble, and about whether commercial climbing had built a culture where reaching the summit mattered more than the person struggling beside the route. Sir Edmund Hillary, the first person confirmed to summit Everest, publicly condemned the culture that had allowed this to happen, arguing that the drive to reach the top had, for some climbers, pushed past basic human obligation. Others pushed back just as hard, pointing out that rescue at that altitude almost never works the way it looks. From a screen at sea level, that dragging an incapacitated adult down from the death zone has ended in double fatalities more than once, and that the same cold, hard judgment that keeps a climber alive can look, from a distance, indistinguishable from indifference. Sharp's death was not an isolated flashpoint either. It forced the climbing world to confront something that had been building quietly for years, as Everest shifted from an expedition reserved for elite mountaineers into a commercial industry, serving paying clients across a huge range of experience levels. Critics argue that the sheer number of people attempting the summit each season, many relying heavily on fixed ropes, hired guides, and bottled oxygen rather than independent judgment, had created a kind of tunnel vision on the mountain itself. When your entire remaining physical reserve is aimed at one goal a few hundred meters, above you, there is very little room left to notice, let alone respond to, anything else. Some veteran climbers argued that decades earlier, when far fewer people attempted Everest and turning back carried less social cost, incidents like this were rarer, not because climbers back then were more virtuous, but because the crowding and the psychological tunnel vision of a packed summit day simply did not exist yet in the same way. Others rejected that framing entirely, arguing it is far too easy for people who have never stood in the death zone to sit at sea level and judge split-second choices made by oxygen-starved climbers fighting for their own survival, and pointing out that successful rescues above 8,000 meters remain exceptionally rare precisely because the resources, strength, and stable weather needed almost never line up at the same time. Same argument resurfaced afterward at sea level between people who had never stood in the death zone and people who had about what should have happened differently. Green Boots himself remained in that alcove for 18 years after the 1996 storm, an unintentional monument that thousands of climbers photographed, stepped around, and used as a marker on their own summit. Attempts. In 2014, a team believed to be linked to the China-Tibet Mountaineering Association, which manages the north side of the mountain, moved the body to a less visible location. No dramatic announcement came with it. Climbers simply began noticing, season after season, that the familiar shape in the alcove was gone. The unofficial checkpoint that had quietly guided 2 decades of rope-length judgment calls disappeared from view, though not from the mountain itself. He was never alone up there either. Everest is currently estimated to hold the remains of more than 200 climbers who never made it back down, scattered across routes on both the north and south sides. Many are in 2007. Further down the mountain, a stretch littered with the bodies and brightly colored gear of past climbers earned the nickname Rainbow Valley, a name that sounds almost peaceful until you understand exactly what it describes. On the south side, a German climber named Hannelore Schmatz, who successfully submitted in 1979, died during her own descent and remained visible near the route for years afterward. Recovery at these altitudes can cost tens of thousands of dollars and requires a team of strong, acclimatized climbers willing to move dead weight, sometimes frozen solid into the exact position the person died in, down some of the most technically demanding and exposed terrain on the planet. Sherpas and porters, who already carry enormous physical risks simply supporting living climbers through the dreary death zone, have themselves been injured and killed during body recovery attempts. For most of Everest's more than 200 lost climbers, the mountain that took their life has also permanently become the place where they remain. There is another layer to this that rarely makes it into the headlines, which is the risk carried by the Sherpas who make any of this possible in the first place. Long before body recovery is ever attempted, Sherpa teams are the ones fixing ropes through the most dangerous sections of the route, pre-positioning oxygen cylinders at the high camps, and guiding paying clients through whiteout conditions where a wrong turn can be fatal within minutes. Some of that capability appears to be more than experience alone. Research published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences by Taring Sherpa and colleagues found that Sherpa populations carry a genetic variant tied to how the body regulates hemoglobin production under low oxygen, a biological head start that still does not make the death zone survivable for long. Every recovery mission on Everest, including the one now underway for Dorje Morup, depends on Sherpa climbers being willing to carry that same risk one more time, for someone else is dead. And here is where this story stops being purely historical and turns into something happening on that mountain right now, in the same year you are watching this. For nearly 30 years, almost everyone, climbers, journalists, and even much of the reporting on this case, believed Green Boots was Sewang Paljor, the 28-year-old head constable from Ladakh who died, alongside Morup and Smanla that same night. It became the accepted version of the story, repeated in articles, books, and documentaries for decades. But in the summer of 2026, as India's Indo-Tibetan Border Police finally moved forward with a long-discussed plan to recover the body and bring it home, DNA testing conducted ahead of the mission quietly overturned that assumption. The remains long called Green Boots were not Sewang Paljor after all. They belonged to Lance Naik Dorje Morup, one of the other 2 men who died on that same descent, identified using genetic evidence gathered during an earlier high-altitude mission to the site, down. But the fact that it is happening at all says something important about how this story has aged. For 30 years, a man became a checkpoint, a nickname, a landmark other people used to measure their own progress toward a goal that was never his. In 2026, for the first time, an entire country is trying to reverse that, to turn the landmark back into a person and carry him home. None of this erases the harder questions the story leaves behind. Roughly 200 people are still up there tonight, permanent residents of the highest place on Earth, most of them far too exposed for anyone to safely reach. Mountaineering courses and expedition briefings now often reference the David Sharp case directly, using it as a case study in the near-impossible calculus of high-altitude rescue. And some commercial expedition companies have since put stricter buddy systems and mandatory check-ins in place, partly in response to the criticism that followed his death. Whether those changes have actually reduced the odds of something similar happening again is difficult to measure, because the underlying problem, oxygen-starved climbers making irreversible decisions in seconds, cannot simply be trained away. It is what the death zone does to every person who enters it, no matter how many protocols exist on paper at base camp, thousands of meters below. The climbers who passed Green Boots and later David Sharp, without fully registering what they were looking at, were not monsters. Many of them were careful, experienced, ethical people in every other part of their lives. But at 8,500 meters, with their own oxygen running low and their own judgment already thinned out by cold and altitude, the moral clarity most of us assume we would have in that exact moment is not guaranteed to survive the climb with you. The death zone does not just take away oxygen. It takes away certainty, memory, and in some documented cases, the basic ability to tell a stranger in crisis apart from a shape you have walked past 100 times before. And maybe that is the most uncomfortable part of this entire story, and also the reason a body correctly identified only this year is suddenly being carried down a mountain instead of left as a checkpoint for someone else's summit day. On Everest, the line between becoming a landmark and staying a person turns out to be thinner than almost anyone standing at sea level would ever guess. And in 2026, for the first time in 30 years, that line is finally being redrawn. Sources referenced in this script for verification and further reading, not for narration, Wikipedia entries on Green Boots, the 1996 Indo-Tibetan Border Police expedition to Mount Everest, and David Sharp, mountaineer. All that's interesting, reporting on the 2026 DNA identification of Green Boots as Dorje Morup, and on David Sharp's death. The Better India, reporting on the DNA identification and recovery plan, July 2026. Snowbrains, reporting on the recovery mission and DNA confirmation, July 2026. Gear Junkie, reporting on the ITBP recovery tender, June 2026. Explorers Web, reporting on the recovery mission timeline and Sherpa team requirements, July 2026. Newsgram, reporting on the recovery mission and Dorje Morup's identification, July 2026. 8 summits and various mountaineering retrospectives on the David Sharp case and Sir Edmund Hillary's public response. Science Alert, reporting on Death Zone. Physiology, Hayes and Hape. New England Journal of Medicine, Grocott et al. Research on arterial oxygen saturation at extreme altitude. Stay curious. Stay ahead of what we don't know yet.